Welcome to week 8 of Political Thought on the Just Rebellion. Today we're going to be looking at more modern forms of rebellion, involving things like social media, for instance, but there's a long build-up to that. In other words, the idea that the individual citizen could make an impact, could use his or her agency to make an impact, both on the part of colleagues, fellow human beings, but also on behalf of oneself. That idea of oneself is recently, a newcomer to the idea of how we conceive of ourselves as agential creatures capable of action, and for what we commit action. Now, we've discussed in previous weeks how really many of the ideas that we regard as natural today really have a very recent origin. The idea of a citizen as opposed to a subject only really began to arise after the French Revolution that began in 1789. But even at that point in time, with all the huge volatile upheavals in history, what you still had was an undefined idea of the capacity of the individual citizen. We discussed Hegel last week, for instance, Hegel who basically conceived of the idea of civil society. And it was something which was an intermediate category, but a very important one, an intermediate category between family and being a member of a state, but was also a means of socialization. Civil society meant that you could be independent of the state, you could organize, for instance, even in the face of the state, but it was within a socialized framework. The idea of being able to form associations, to be able to form groups that would cooperate together for a common purpose, a common historical destiny, for instance. That was something taken forward by Marx and by Lenin, that there would be a working class able to forge a common destiny. The idea that within this class there could be individuation was something not stressed. And indeed, Marx looked with some degree of disdain on the whole idea of individuation. It was something that was reserved, really, if you look at his late writings, for what he called a lumpen proletariat, an offshoot of the main proletariat, which was necessarily the working class, an offshoot that was unorganized because it was basically antisocial and criminal. In other words, people that we would today try to forge into some kind of rainbow nation were regarded as beyond the social pale by Marx. These include homosexual people, these included prostitutes, these included the layabouts of the world. In other words, those who did not have a role in production as he conceived of it. But really, to deny agency to everyone who was not involved in production would be to limit agency to participation in a material universe, a productive material universe. The idea of a productive non-material universe, that was something which derived from Hegel, but which Marx did not greatly develop. It was the redevelopment of the original Hegelian idea that's going to consume us today. The idea that you don't have to be involved as a foundation for your agency in material production. You don't have to be a member of the working class. You didn't have to be a member of any class, actually. You did have to have the sense that you were being victimized, immiserated, oppressed, that you were, rather than being a fully realized citizen, regarded by those above you as some kind of cipher in the way that they wished to organize society. So basically what you had was the idea of a rebellion against the idea of being a cipher down there by those who ruled from up there. And rebellions against that kind of idea were basically a reiteration of the ideals of the French Revolution that tried to establish the idea of a horizontal society. The structure of government necessarily remained vertical. We elected, we chose people who took their place up there, governed us down here, but that government was mediated by our rights and by our right to deselect or not elect them again. And that was the idea. This became a new social contract that was horizontally founded, that horizontal and vertical dimensions, but the horizontal was meant to reign supreme. But the nature of the horizontal, the development of that nature, was what consumed a very great deal of post-war thought in not just Europe, but the United States and many other parts of the world as the post-war years began to gather momentum. World War II ended in 1945, and by the end of the 1950s, going into the 1960s, what you had was a ferment of thought which stressed the idea, the Hegelian idea, of individual agency, individual capacity that was not necessarily material. Now, we already have discussed the thought of Ali Shariati, an Iranian who studied in France for the first part of the 1960s, and who, as part of his Red Shia, not only saw a reform of Shia as a religion and a reform of Iran as a state, but also saw the refurbishment of the idea, essentially borrowed from Sufism, of the individual as being able to have a direct, transcendental relationship with God. In this relationship, what was transcended was the necessity for an intervening and a mediating institution. You didn't have to have the church. You yourself, as an individual, would achieve a transcendental union with God. So the nature of the self, the nature of the individual agential self, had capacity basically which was universal. And the idea of universal human rights as being part of one's individual experience and part of one's intellectual and moral inheritance from the universe was something which probably derived from Kantian thought, but which also was refurbished as a form of Hegelianism in the 1960s. Now, a great deal of movement and thought in the 1960s, as I said, with had a look at Shariati, who was greatly influenced, as I said, by the ideas that he encountered in Paris, the ideas of absurdity and existential aloneness, that it was the person by himself, herself, that had to struggle in the face of an often senseless universe, the idea of sensibility in the face of chaos, derived, emanated from, originated from within the self. And this meant, whether one liked it or not, some sense of recourse to thinkers who are not directly political. In other words, it involved in the post-war years a recourse to thinkers who were interested in the individual psyche. When you look at French philosophy today, the whole, as it were, psycholinguistic movement that one associates with Jacques Lacan, with Julia Kristeva, and with others of that sort, Deleuze, Guattari, was a marrying of psychoanalytic and philosophical thought, and in almost every single case is dependent, at least on interpretations, of the work of Sigmund Freud. In other words, what you saw in the 60s was refurbishment of the reputation of Freud. So that along with Marx, at that point in time, what you had was probably a conceptualization of the two most important intellectual influences of the 20th century involving the material and the psychic, Marx and Freud. And this is probably best expressed by the American political philosopher Herbert Marcuse, whose works began to have some kind of impact in the 1950s, but which gained a zenith of impact in the 1960s. His great book, Eros and Civilization, was basically required reading for my entire generation. We grew up basically spouting Herbert Marcuse. And what you had in this title, Eros and Civilization, was in fact not only a genuflection to the influence of Freud, you also had the sense that the self constituted what we now have in common discourse. The self has its own ontological authenticity. The self was an ontology unto itself. It could create its own meaning and necessarily had to create its own meaning in the face of its own internal psychic drives. So you had the sense that the individual could stand out against the material and political forces of the universe. And this ontology of self basically depended upon a psychology of self. And this set into motion an entire, as it were, movement and thought which has lasted to this day, in which the individual psyche had as much importance in the way that we configure our relationship with the universe as any kind of philosophical speculation or theorization. It's no accident that someone like Frantz Fanon, for instance, was a trained psychiatrist. It's no accident that someone like Michel Foucault was a trained psychiatrist. The whole idea of how society tries to rule you by bearing down on your psyche, and how it's through the ontology of the psyche that one resists, that is very, very much to do with the non-material foundation of the organization of self outside of civil society that was developed from the thought of Hegel. And someone like Herbert Marcuse and others of his generation, Erich Fromm, for instance, absolutely epitomized that in their writings. But it wasn't just thinkers like Marcuse. It was a whole group of people who had, as it were, a more applied, a more practical sense of what was required of oneself, not just as an individual, but oneself immersed in a world in which there are other people. How do you help other people not fall into the category of those who are merely used as ciphers by those up there? How do you prevent them, if we're to use today's vocabulary, from being structured into mere artifacts of the state and what we might perhaps loosely call the working class? How do we mandate them, encourage them, educate them to retain their individuality? This is where the idea of education became extremely important, and it's where we turn to the work of Ivan Illich, half Croatian, half of, let us say, mixed descent, a bit of a gypsy on one side of his family, a multilinguist, very highly trained. He had a doctorate from the Vatican, which meant that he basically began life as a theologian and, of course, in keeping with the ethos of liberation theology, which began to develop in the post-war years, understood that he had to regard himself as a dissident theologian. So he didn't last long in terms of his career in the Catholic Church. But I think two things mark him out. And the first thing is the nature of schooling as a major theme in his thought. And this is epitomized in this great book, De-Schooling society. In other words, you're structured as a servant, as a commodity, so that you can't exercise your agency. You're structured by an educational structure to be part of a greater structure. The educational structure acts on behalf of a ruling structure. So the idea of being de-schooled did not mean not getting educated. It meant being educated by other means. And in particular, and this is part of the rebellion against a merely material ethos and a merely material analysis of the world, of the universe. In particular, you could not allow yourself to be schooled into becoming a commodified subject of the ruling class. The idea of commodification is something which is almost hackneyed now. We use this as a common term. It's not perhaps quite as fashionable as it was even 10 years ago. But the idea of being turned into a product, in other words, in the material universe, one doesn't even make product anymore. One doesn't produce. One is actually articulated as a product, something which the machine spews out to take its place as a cipher within the structure that the machine ordains. The idea in the work of Ivan Illich is to escape the machine, to escape commodification, and in the matter of schooling, to escape syllabus. In other words, to escape being confined to being produced in knowledge in specialist categories that deny the holistic nature of the individual and that individual's independent agency. It was an impossibly idealistic vision, and he was so antipathetic towards being commodified, particularly by the machine society, as he called it, by the instruments of structure, that he, well, you could probably call him in some way the father of the anti-vaxxers. He suffered from cancer, for instance, and refused to have it treated. He had a cancerous growth on his face, which he refused to take drugs for, and he refused to have operated upon. He did not want to be part of the medical system, of being commodified into a patient. It didn't stop him, of course, taking a lot of opium to treat the pain that the cancer caused. So whether we like it or not, we're commodified in one way or another, either by the official machine or by unofficial machines. The unofficial machines may be described as being in some kind of rebellion, at least, against the official machine, although a more likely analysis might be that they operate in parallel, two separate machines that perhaps intersect far more than even Illich would like to have admitted. But the idea of being against the machine should not be taken literally. For instance, even in the 1960s and early 1970s, he saw the possibility of computers. Now, don't forget, in those days, no one had an individual computer. The idea of a laptop or a tablet was something like a wild dream. A computer was something that required banks and banks and banks of machinery in special rooms, whirring away with tapes spinning, as in the very, very early James Bond films, for instance. So if you go right back to the very first Sean Connery films, you'll sometimes see examples of what a computer was meant to look like. They still look like that at major scientific installations, but being able to pack into one smartphone the technology that used to fit into one of these gigantic computers, that was unthought of. But Illich envisaged a world in which the computer could be an instrument of learning. In other words, I could learn online from one another. That was the core of what he was trying to say. you, someone else, could in real time exchange knowledge, debate, compare, come to conclusions, come to a mode of learning which was Socratic, electronic, but did not depend in the first instance on a supervening authority that said this is what you had to learn and this is the manner in which you had to learn it. As I say, that's an impossible dream, or is it? Because if you look now at his legacy, well, there was certainly a whole string of experimental schools who tried to put this kind of liberation pedagogy, if you like, into effect, including in this country. Even one or two universities, tried to adopt that kind of unstructured free learning. But really, his legacy is writ most large in Finland, where recent educational reforms basically desyllabalize the school. Learning is organic, learning is holistic. So at primary school in Finland, students learn, as Illich would say, freely. It's perhaps no conspicuous accident that Finland right now has a prime minister and a cabinet of young women all in their 30s. I think this could be made into a real claim for the merits and the benefits of feminism. But it's certainly something which can claim to be one of the fruits of the work that someone like Illich tried to start. And I hasten to add that Finland, up to now in any case, has produced, let us say, learning of the most remarkable level. I used to joke with my students when I used to take the doctoral methodology classes that I had to give the lectures at a halfway point. If you came from a country like China, for instance, where in those days you were required to learn by rote, you would find it very hard. If you came from Great Britain, you would find it difficult. If you came from Finland, and what I would have to say would be absurdly simple, but I had to take, as it were, a middle path. So the idea of turning a very, very high-level educational system into an unstructured one is quite a revolutionary step by the Finnish people. And we shall see whether in our structured measurements, like does it get you entry into a university outside Finland, what the products will be in due course. Certainly in the years where I was a visiting professor in Finland, the highest level of theoretical thought was possible. And my debates with Finnish colleagues were something which I thought at least was astounding. They probably thought I was incredibly simplistic. Choosing unstructured approaches to schooling, choosing deschooling, is, as I said, probably a product of Ivan Illich's work. Very much, as it were, like an icon of the 1960s against the machine, rage against the machine, but also in some ways appallingly middle class. Now, the machine had much to answer for in the 1960s. That's why you had the Black Panthers in the United States of America. The machine had racism as a charge that it had to answer. That's why you had the entire attempt in 1968 in France with the student uprisings in Paris and other cities, basically to reform the curriculum at university level because it was too structured and too arrogantly backward looking. Looking forward was what the students were demanding, looking for something that could liberate their senses of possibility in the future, although they didn't go as far as to say that structure should be removed and syllabus should be removed entirely. But as I say, these were essentially middle class aspirations in middle class societies. Even the Panthers in the United States would be regarded as middle class by those in liberation movements in African countries, for instance. So much so that when the heat got too much for many of the Panthers and they went to live in exile in African countries, many of them found it almost impossible to cope with actual duress, which not only had a material basis, but of course had a huge psychic impact. Was it possible to have a liberation pedagogy that was not middle class? And this is where we come to the work of Paulo Freire. This great book that came out in 1971, the product of a great deal of thought and experimentation in the 1960s, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And it was very, very much something which was impacted by his experiences in Brazil under military dictatorship. And if not military dictatorship, then tending towards that condition of a hierarchy that wiped out the possibilities of horizontal equality. Not that there was horizontal equality in Brazil. Even now, the condition of the favelas, the slum areas, the ghettos that ring the great cities of Brazil, on the hillsides of Rio, on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, those speak to layers of horizontality where it's impossible for those in the bottom horizontal layer to rise to the top layer of horizontality, let alone rise to high places in government without major upheaval in the way the system works. So Paulo Freire looked at the very poorest sections of rural Brazil. He looked at impoverished villages. He took a neo-Marxist approach to their impoverishment. He was greatly influenced by Frantz Fanon, who in turn should be regarded as a member, at least an honorary member, of the Dependencia school of neo-Marxist thought, that at the bottom one is not only miserable, but one is immiserated by the forces of exploitation that come down from above and the sucking away of resources by a process of accumulation that rises to the benefit of those above. And to make it easy for those above, those at the bottom are structured in the way that they conceive of themselves as lacking any agency to change the lot that has been assigned to them down below from up above. Now, Paulo Freire said, no, actually you can change the sense of agency. But the pedagogy of the oppressed has to be an education system that depends on a person learning from interaction with his or her environment, his or her economic condition, and relationship of his or her economy with layers of economy rising up above. In other words, one's sense of self has got to be immersed in a practical day-to-day learning that cannot escape an appreciation of one's place in a wider political economy. And learning to read and write while recognizing one's condition as immiserated economically and politically meant that one's education was one of self-realization, but also an education in terms of one's recognition of self within a system in this case of exploitation, a system which was so strong it had been effectively structured into place. But all the same, learning that through oneself and oneself cooperating with others in the same condition, the pedagogy of the oppressed could change the nature of oppression. So there are communities throughout Latin America, including Brazil, to this day, where the practice of self-help is one which seeks to help people at the bottom rise above. What they can rise to is another question, because of course there is a fundamental limit to how far you can rise if your education cannot, in these days, encompass, for instance, access to electronic means of communication and education, what Illich looked forward to. If it cannot encompass higher forms of learning that require machines, industry, in other words. In other words, can you have a liberation pedagogy within a subsistence local economy? Or does the economy itself have to move forward, and what are the contradictions of this moving forward for those who are at the very base of the heap? Even so, the pedagogy of the oppressed has a real value in today's world, because in helping one another learn, while conscious one of one's own and of the other's political economic condition, and where this fits into the social and economic hierarchy of one's larger environment, learning the self-realization in the sense of not just being isolated, but being within something larger, and one is seeking to change not only oneself, but one's capacity to interact more beneficially for oneself with this larger environment and to change that larger environment. This idea of self-realization in that kind of context is something which is fundamentally of importance, that you don't have to accept your lot in life. The Brazilian theater director, Boal, was someone who talked about the theater of the oppressed, Augusto Boal, and his experimental theatrical works did away with the whole distinction between audience and actors. Everyone joined in. And the idea that through joining in, through the removal of a barrier between those who act and those who watch, meant a joint, unified level of appreciation for the creation of art, the creation of expression, the creation of a joint community which no longer had the distinction between watcher and watched. Now, this was incredibly difficult to pull off, of course, and Boal's plays, if you can call them that, were deliberate invitations to blur, if not obliterate, this distinction. But they were also very carefully structured in the first instance, so that as theatre, all of those in the theatre, audience or actor, would be encouraged to try to blur that distinction. You can't escape structure altogether. Those kinds of community interactions, however, are very, very much part of movements which continue, just like movements in the name of Illich or underneath the influence, part of the legacy of Illich. Those two from the 60s and early 70s could probably be described accurately as having transformed our ideas of education, even if we don't follow the actuality of what it was that they would have liked us to be able to engage with, follow, adopt, and use as a means of transforming ourselves and our institutions. So we can perhaps rehearse or further the legacy of what these people were talking about if, when we come to the question and discussion part of this particular course, we can all engage as fruitfully as possible. To talk back, to argue back, is a form of learning how to fight back, of course. And in expressing yourself, you express your agency. There are different forms of expression, particularly in the Brazil of the 1960s and early 1970s. As I said, lurching towards dictatorial rule. I've put up on the blackboard on the BLE site a song by Caetano Veloso. The clip I found was him singing one of his famous songs in his middle age, which he wrote when he was exiled to London. He had to flee to London in, I think, 1971. And it's called London, London. And it's basically a song which expresses amazement that if you go up to a policeman in the street in London and ask for directions, the policeman's going to give you directions. He's almost happy to see you, and he's not going to beat you to a pulp, which was his experience in Brazil. This politeness, this politesse of the London Bobby did not disguise, of course, racism within the force as a whole. We still have instances of that today, but at least the superficial demeanor of oppression was removed. It may be only a superficial element that was removed. That itself is still up for debate, analysis, and action today. But he and other musicians like Gilberto Gil had to take exile in this country because of not being able anymore to retain their freedom in a dictatorial, militarized Brazil. They founded a musical movement called Tropicalia. From time to time, the Barbican in London has a retrospective of their work. It was not just a musical movement, but involved other arts as well, but became most famous for its musical performances, which, when we look at them, when we listen to them today, seem remarkably tame. It's not as if you're looking at revolutionary music. It's not as if you're looking at anything that was profoundly experimental in music. It just expressed basically very simple lyrics to do with the sense of being able to be individual in the face of a military apparatus that sought to crush individuality, so that the possibility of individual protest and the possibility of that individual protest becoming organized protest, mass protest, even the singing of a simple song could land you into difficulties, particularly if there's a movement among musicians, plural, already a sense of organization, or curiously singing songs about individual freedom. So the Tropicalia movement was recognized by the military leaders of Brazil at that point in time as having those seeds of difficulty for the regime. They're recognized as a rebellion. It's funny how music achieves this sense of being rebellious, and even commodified music can have this kind of effect. This is one of the contradictions that are inescapable. For instance, it was in the 1960s when what became known as the independence movement of Eritrea from Ethiopia began to gather momentum. It was something which began with people fleeing into the hills to become fighters, to become armed rebels against the government of Ethiopia, against an increasingly communist government of Ethiopia. That began to take shape from the 1960s, late 1960s, at precisely the time when Jimi Hendrix was approaching his zenith as an amazing guitarist. Now, this is something perhaps you're not so familiar with, but your parents will be. Hendrix did a take of Bob Dylan's version, or Bob Dylan's song. He did a version of Bob Dylan's song, All Along the Watchtower. Now, if you listen to Hendrix's version of All Along the Watchtower, he uses in the instrumental breaks what we used to call a wah-wah pedal. Every self-respecting wannabe rock and roll musician had a fuzz box and a wah-wah pedal. These were distortion pedals by which you could bend the notes you played on your guitar. If you had one of these things that you see in the background, a very antique Fender Stratocaster, you plug that into your amplifier through a wah-wah pedal. And it did what its name suggested. It bent your notes to make them sound like wah, 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 wah. And in his song, All Along the Watchtower, You had the wah-wah pedal used with a sliding chord. And the distortion was really quite amazing, as well as the individual notes distorted with a wah-wah effect. Well, two things. The incipient young guerrillas of Eritrea, who finally achieved independence at the beginning of the 1990s after a 30-year war of liberation. They went up into the hills inspired by Hendrix. They grew their hair so they looked like the wild and woolly hairstyles of Hendrix. When I first met them, when I was meant to be training the new Ministry of Foreign Affairs just before independence and after independence, in the first part of the 1990s, and I looked at my class of future diplomats, and all I could see were these wild young men, no, not quite so young anymore, sporting huge afros. And the other thing that they did was they electrified their zithers, their harps. They invented their own wah-wah pedals, and to this day, the national music of independent Eritrea uses the wah-wah pedal. You can't escape, as it were, that particular international influence, which has become a national legacy. I apologize to any Eritrean friends in the lecture audience. I can't stand the music myself, but in the days when I was allowed to visit Eritrea, I'm a bit persona non grata there these days. That was what you had to listen to day and night. And yes, if you asked the fighters about Hendrix, yeah, they knew about Hendrix. But what this meant was that international influences reached the immiserated. In other words, it wasn't just power coming down. It was influences coming down that could inspire you to liberate yourself upwards. So it asks the question of the whole Paulo Freire experiment. Can it be confined to the village anymore? Can the pedagogy of the oppressed be a self-contained exercise in agency and rebellion? Or is the world now inescapable? And is the trick now to abstract and extrapolate from the world things that are beneficial so that you can defy those parts of the world that are certainly not beneficial, which are oppressive? Does the pedagogy of the oppressed have now to be international? Does it have to take upon itself some sense of the universal that is all the same selective? And even in learning about the oppressor, there's always the statement of Chairman Mao that one must understand one's enemy better than the enemy understands himself. What is off limits in terms of one's learning? What is desirable at the risk of corruption of oneself in one's learning? So questions to be asked. And of course, the international is unavoidable now. What you have is very, very much protest in the world today, which depends upon the international. When you look at the great movements, you look at Tahrir Square, for instance, you look at its forerunner, the uprising in Tehran, Iran, the so-called Green Revolution of 2009, what you had were people who were able to be in communication with one another. And my own hilarious, almost pathetic story about this was that at that point in time, this is now more than 10 years ago, I was having my teeth redone. This is something that you normally do as a teenager, but I was having braces applied by an Iranian orthodontist. And he had a brother on the streets of Tehran. I had a student on the streets of Tehran, and they were both involved in the Green Revolution uprising. And this is a very funny thing to transact when you've got an instrument, you've got a mouthful of very sharp instruments. But he would suddenly look down at his cell phone, and there's a text message from his brother saying, the police are closing in on us. And then at the same moment, my student would send me a text saying, we're escaping from the police down Avenue such and such. And I would tell my orthodontist, who would then text back to his brother, find street such and such so you can escape from the police enclosure. In other words, in real time, across a vast swathe of landmass, what you had was the possibility of at least instances of survival, if not organization. Of course, this began to be writ large in the Arab Spring, and particularly in Tahrir Square. I want you to hear some statistics. These were statistics compiled by a 2012 study from the University of North Carolina. The height of the Tahrir Square demonstrations were 2011, and it was a very curious uprising. People of all classes were involved. I had an Egyptian student who was my PhD student. In the middle of supervisions, her telephone would ring, would be her mother, down in Tahrir Square, saying, "Darling, it's a lovely day for a revolution. I wish you could be here." All said very loudly in English, knowing that I should be the one also to overhear and spread the word that this was an omni-citizen uprising, civilians against the military rulers of Egypt. But they organized themselves in a way which is pretty much the prefigure, the forerunner of anything we wish to organize today. Extinction Rebellion, for instance, would be impossible without electronic organization, which of course begs all kinds of questions of contradiction in terms of the industrial manufacture and the exploitation involved in the rare metals required for today's cell phones. But organization is probably a greater benefit, perhaps, than the depredations and harm caused, perhaps. But in Tahrir Square, going back almost a decade, 2011, of those interviewed by the University of North Carolina, 52% were on Facebook, 16% were on Twitter, that'll be much greater now, 48.4% replied that they heard of the demonstrations, not from traditional news sources, but by non-traditional electronic sources. 48.2% of the citizens were involved in news sharing. On Facebook, 25%. On their cell phones, 15%. On Twitter, 5%. And by email, the rest, with a residue on texting. Those percentages would probably have altered quite greatly now. And of course, there are all kinds of apps now which make this kind of communication much faster and much more common. In other words, you can have one message spread out instantly across a great commonality. And for the first time, you can actually outflank the police in real time. Your real time is faster than their real time. And as more of you can communicate. And of course, with means of communication now, encrypted messaging, Telegram, for instance, even WhatsApp, all of these things mean that you have modes of escaping immediate detection, which allows you a space of organization which cannot be immediately double guessed and spied upon. So you have a strange equalization in terms of capacity, both to rebel in a way that, at least for brief minutes, equals, if not surpasses, the capacity of those above to suppress the rebellion. So all of us, I think, have been involved in recent demonstrations of one sort or another, and the cell phone, at the very least, has become almost the epitome, almost the emblem of what you need to have in the streets in order to be able to move quickly, in order to be able to move efficaciously, not just to escape the police, but in the more, let us say, advanced demonstrations for today's street fighting men and street fighting women to be able to outflank the police, and for the real crazies basically to take the fight back, perhaps, to the police. So this is a real advance from, say, the days of Tiananmen Square, where in 1989 you had the students of Beijing rising up, and on the night of the slaughter, when the tanks went in, we were keeping vigil in the University of Kent in Canterbury, hunched around a fax machine. Okay, I'm not sure how many of you have actually even seen, let alone have operated a fax machine. Very slow printout of a photograph. We were depending on those who managed to escape, sending out photographs of the massacre on fax machines. So they would be able to send out one photographic fax at a time to individual telephone numbers. So the division of duty was you tried to ring or fax as many people in the outside world with whom you were in contact, hoping they did have a fax machine, of course. And that one faxed photo, which was not of the highest resolution and definition, would then be faxed on to other people, which we did all night long. We were refaxing and refaxing and refaxing to try to spread the word. Of course, every subsequent fax made the image more and more blurred until by the end, or well before the end of the night anyway, the image was of no use. So getting out the image in real time today and being able to ensure that that image is shared with a huge audience instantly, that is something which has transformed the nature of rebellion. And those above can't deny the evidence that has been seen by millions of people in real time. The real time is faster than the time it requires for the oppressors to react. So if you're going to have, as it were, a choice of vision between Paulo Freire, a centered pedagogy of the oppressed in the locality of those who are oppressed, a solidarity because of a common and a shared fate, a shared condition, the more expansive, if middle-class vision of Ivan Illich, that one day there would be a computer that could do such things that we've been describing, well, today's world has come firmly down on the side of Illich. So that's the future. I for a time had some hopes of breaking through with another crazy project when I was talking to the chief executive of Diageo. For those of you who are interested in alcohol and will know that Diageo makes Johnny Walker and it makes Guinness. It's one of the great, let us say, depraving companies of the world. The chief executive, he unfortunately is no longer the chief executive, rather enjoyed my company as a lunch guest. He could unload himself in terms of all his frustrations that he developed in trying to run Diageo. And I wasn't a member of his staff. I wasn't in the drinks industry. I appreciated the difference between red label, black label, green label, and blue label. And blue label Johnny Walker whiskey is something that is worth, let's say, doing disreputable things for. But I tried to convince him, okay, look, the era of sending hundreds and thousands, as SOAS students used to, we basically furnished the entire library of the University of South Sudan when that country became independent. with books, both second-hand books, library books we no longer needed, and new books, overstocks, donated by publishers. We sent thousands of books to the University of South Sudan. Many of the students sweet-talked the cargo handlers to provide containers, free shipping, and got them to Juba in South Sudan, where the cargo containers were then turned into classrooms, as well as the books being added to the library of the University of Juba in South Sudan. But I said to the chief executive of Diageo, look, we shouldn't do this anymore. One tablet can have 1,000 books, more actually. One tablet, a simple one, made in India or Nigeria, can be sourced for $10 per unit. What we do is we litter the villages of the emerging world with tablets. We emulate Chinese technology and have solar-powered recharging stations, which could also recharge cell phones in each village. Instantly, we take a generation jump in terms of learning, in terms of communication, in terms of organization. But this necessarily marries the inside world with the outside world. So the point I'm trying to make is that the pedagogy of the oppressed today depends on the pedagogy of solidarity across generations of technological accomplishment. For die-hard followers of Fourier, that's a hard thing to swallow because, of course, there are immense benefits in a pedagogy of the oppressed. Neighborly solidarity as a condition of efficacious and generous citizenship. One is a citizen with others. That is something which can be easily dissipated in a wider context. We also go against the, let us say, anti-technological sense of even Illich in his war against the commodification of the self, of the psyche, of the soul. We would want, I hope, to have the COVID vaccine. We would want, we hope, if at some stage we develop cancer, to be treated with the best possible medical technologies. We would want, if we could attain them, a radiotherapy, a chemotherapy. We wouldn't want to rely entirely on natural alternatives, perhaps, but the majority of people, those with very clear social consciences wanting to do something agential in the world, would still wish to go down a technological route. The marriage of these things, so one de-schools in terms of not being predestined to become a commodified cipher in a machine, and one is de-schooled to be able to take the best of modern technology and apply it to the betterment of humanity. One is not structured along lines of specialist learning, but has an appreciation of all branches of learning well before the moment of specialization. One becomes an engineer after having first become someone knowledgeable of the classics, for instance. All of these things are part of a new dream, a hybrid dream, a dream which seeks to marry perhaps impossible opposites, differences, making schooling, de-schooling, pedagogy, something which is the middle class, something which is for those who are oppressed, making all of that into one holistic bundle upon which we must settle our horizons for analysis and our horizons for how we conceive of action. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.